Does it take more time to do like underlining story plots than to add to like your overall story plot? Does that take more time?
You mean the planning stages before I'm actually writing scenes?
Does it take more time?
Does it take more time? I don't know if it does. It seems like it all takes a bunch of time. To me, there's two different rewarding processes there. That type of planning, to me, is where the original ideas start, and I get really excited about that, and that's a lot of fun. To actually render a scene, I have to have total concentration. I've got to be left alone. I'm probably need an hour reading back over what I've written before I ever write anything new. It's hard to fit that in when you're a full-time husband and father. A lot of my stuff this first book was written when I was traveling doing documentaries. I was writing this in airports and hotel rooms when I had time to myself. I would say this. I have a whole thing I could do about the process, the actual process of workflow of writing. But I find that if I'm really hard to find time to devote to what I'm doing, I will write scenes out in description form first. I have a certain software that's used to help organize all this. I don't just write in Microsoft Word. The software is called Scrivener, and it's really good for helping you organize large works. But instead of writing a full scene, I'll write it like I'm describing to somebody else what just happened. And that way I kind of know, it's more than just a thumbnail or an outline. I kind of know what that story is. I do that for every one. And then when I have time to write, I'm not spending an hour trying to get ready. I look at that description and I'm already where I need to be. And if I only have 5 minutes, at least I'm doing 5 minutes of actual writing. So time management is a big, big part of it. But it's all fun. It's all, especially for me, fantasy stuff. Hands?
On average, how long did you do writing school?
Depends on how much time I have to devote to it. It's a good question. This first book, I had spent years developing the idea. I had this idea for 10 years before I actually had the courage to feel like I was ready to write it. I wrote it in 13 months. I wrote it from November of 07 to January or February of 09. And then it spent 5 years on the post-production process and finding the art for it. And so during those 5 years, I started writing the next book. And after this book came out in 2014, it was not until 2018 that my second book came out. So it looks like a 4-year gap between books. It was actually more like an 8-year gap because this had a long gestation period. And I was on the road. In my life, in my career, I was traveling a lot. I was able to write this fairly quickly. My second book, different story. I had changed jobs. I was home a lot more. And it took forever to write. It took me years and years to write it. It was also complicated. A lot of moving pieces in Act 2. That's where your complication takes place. And I had to coordinate a lot of different actions. And it was just tougher. It was tougher in the planning stage for Act 2. By Act 3, I flew through Act 3. I knew everything that was going to happen. And I was able to write in my spare time because it just came out. By the time I was writing the third book, I could see the finish line, and I was just going for it as fast as I could. And the heavy lifting of creating new things was over. It was all about finishing the message that I had started and making sure that I hit the points that I wanted to hit for the reader. So it takes a different amount of time. Now, book 3 took me probably a year and a half, beginning to end, but really all the work took place in about 3 months. I had 3 different months of where I had this huge creative outburst, and all the work was done in those 3 months. So if I had been uninterrupted, I would have been done in 90 days. So it's you got to find a rhythm, and you got to find your time. Managing time with a full-time job and a family, that's the biggest challenge of all this. Yes, sir?
Do your characters have more than one personality?
Do my characters, or can they?
Can they?
They can. It's possible.
Is it good?
It depends on the story you're telling. I would say as a general rule, you probably don't want that, unless your story is in that area because people don't have split personalities unless they've got something going on psychologically. So is your story about psychology? Then maybe. In an action, adventure, heroic fantasy setting, it's probably not going to happen. And I would say find a distinctive voice for every character, so that even if you don't have attribution next to their lines of dialogue, the reader will just kind of know who's saying it based on how it's written. If you can pull that off, then you have a distinctive voice for that character. You're doing a good job.
Do you write backstory before you write your character, or do you write it while you're writing your character?
That's an awesome question. Man, can we go all day? I do both. I have to do a certain amount of backstory planning before I can sit down and write. But also, I allow myself to be open to surprises. Like I say, characters surprise you. A lot of times those surprises are revealed through dialogue, and it may inform me more about that character. Maybe I go back and revise the backstory. Maybe it's got ripple effects. I got to go revise a whole bunch of stuff in my book because that's a really good idea and I got to use it. Or maybe it just helps me going forward. I've absolutely have done both, but I would say you got to have a certain amount of planning. There's a debate among writers. It's called plotting or pantsing. And by pantsing, they mean, do you just go by the seat of your pants and you improvise everything? Or do you plot it out and outline it and you have everything carefully organized first before you ever write the first word? I'm both. I basically improvise my outline. And at the same time, so if your outline gives you a roadmap, here you are in Tennessee and you want to go to Colorado, well, there's your map and you're like, yep, you plan out your route. I'm going to go this way, this way, and this way. But you know what? We're going to stop in Texas also because there's a cousin I need to see there. And then we're going to go up here. There's your map. There's your plan. You start writing. What you don't know at that stage is where are the roadblocks, where are the traffic jams, where's the cool scenery, where's the local attraction that catches your eye. So what I'm saying is be open to surprises and let your story go where it wants to go. Yes, sir.
Would it be perfectly fine to have side stories within your own story if it fits the plot?
If it fits the plot, definitely. If it fits the theme, maybe. You start looking at word count and format and length and stuff like that. If it's gonna inform the plot, absolutely. I have a group of characters, and they're rarely all together in one place. They're all kind of doing different things. They're all each true to themselves, but at the same time, what they're doing has implications for what happens at the end. So what's really cool is like in that third book, when everything comes together in the new world, the synthesis world, maybe that's incorporating elements that have been developed in multiple storylines, multiple plot lines. Sometimes, so an idea that I'm working on is I'm going to tell a collection of short stories that are untold tales, which side stories that are concurrent within the events of these books, but they weren't worth taking up pages in these books. It's like something that happened off page. I'm going to like tell that story. So there's never a definitive yes or no to the creative process. It just doesn't work for your story. I would say if it does not tie into your plot or your theme, probably doesn't belong in there. And if you've got to be concerned about word count or the length, the format you're working in, then you probably need to say, is there another way to accomplish the same goal, plot-wise, in a more concise manner?
So would the same work for, like, if you want to have a flashback to a certain point in time, would you want to try and make it fit into the story more, or would you try and make it a side plot?
So it's going to depend on, is that flashback accomplishing a plot point that you need? Okay, so if there's something that happens in the past that you got to have, then you got to tell that story. If you're only telling a flashback because you put the time into the backstory and you want to show it off, it probably doesn't belong in your main book. Maybe it's an untold tale that you do later. But if it's serving a story function, then yeah, you should tell it. So I want to say this: your structure is your skeleton, but it's not your meat. Okay, a lot of stories share the same skeleton, but if that's all there was to it, you wouldn't need to. I mean, we would have read all the stories already, and there would be nothing fun left to read. So the meat is how you actually render a scene, the characters you develop, the words you choose, the imagery you're able to paint. So there's, whether you're getting bitten by a radioactive spider or the stormtroopers are burning down your home, there are different ways to hit the same points in the story beats in your structure. Okay, there's different ways to accomplish it in ways that will inform your character in the way you want them informed, that will teach the lesson in the theme that you're working with. Yes?
How hard is it to add new characters into later books in a series?
It's not hard. So in my case, I introduced everybody important in the first book. I feel like all the key players, generally speaking, should be introduced in some form in the first book And if not, at least you are foreshadowing their arrival. So I've got a major character that shows up in the third book. That's vital to the resolution of the entire story. He doesn't show up until the third book. But the foreshadowing, the hints of him showing up are planted in this first book. I knew when I was writing this what I was going for with that particular character. And so I started establishing it right away. So if you've laid the groundwork, even if it's not obvious to the reader that, hey, this is what you're doing, hey, there's a new character coming along. But if you're just putting in the groundwork, when the time comes to bring that character in, then you don't lose anybody. They buy into it. Yes, sir? Yes, ma'am.
How long have you been writing books?
I've been a fan of storytelling my whole life. Even when I was your age, I started reading comic books. I'm still a comic book fan. But I love them because I never enjoyed them just like immersed in the story. I've always enjoyed them looking at it from the outside from a craft perspective of what the writer was doing. That's how my brain's always worked. I've always enjoyed it. So in the process of just reading stories my whole life, I've kind of looked at it from a structural point of view. I took classes at the University of Georgia in drama, in story theory, where I learned more of this stuff. So it was a lifetime interest in how storytelling works. But the actual writing of stories, I first started probably 2006. So that's been about 14 years now. My first short stories that I showed you at the very beginning, the first one was published in 2007. So I've been writing for 14 years. My 2 novels have come out in 2014 and 2018, and my 3rd novel, I hope, will be out in 2021. We're at the beginning of the editing process with that right now. And by the way, I could do another hour on publishing, but I am about to take over publishing for myself, for my novels. And when I do that, now that I've written the 3rd book, there's more I could say in the 1st book that can kind of bring it all together in a more cohesive way, tie it all together a little more tightly. And so I'm doing revised editions, taking over publishing, and I'll be relaunching. And when I do that, I'll have a website and all that kind of stuff. Yes, sir?
How do you know to keep tempo in your book? Like you don't go too long or too short?
Tempo. First, tempo, there should be a rhythm of rising action and falling action. Okay? But as far as book length, that's a tough one. You kind of know, you look at, so if you're writing a trilogy, all I can do is tell you my experience. I'm going to look at each book as an act in the 3-act play. So I know that in this first book, I know where I'm starting, in the known world, hero's comfortable, nothing too exciting is happening, this is just his life. And then the big climactic scene at the end that pushes him across the threshold to the point of no return into the unknown world. I know the beginning and the end, I've got to get there. So I've got to hit my points as quickly as I can. You don't want to waste any words. Don't find yourself filling pages or filling lines because you feel like you need a bunch of words. Okay, you need to be concise and deliberate with your language. And so you write those out and see where you go. And then you work with an editor, and if you've got a restriction on your word count, then you need to do some rethinking. 300 pages, this one's about 97,000 words. 300 pages, 5.5 by 8.5, paperback. My second book is about 116,000 words. My 3rd book came out to 100,000 words. My 3rd book, I thought my 3rd act was going to be really short. I felt like I'll just be a race to the finish line. It's one reason why I wrote it so quickly, because I thought this is going to be short. I thought it was going to be like a 60,000 word book. It'll be like 2/3 of this, maybe. And it ended up being right in the middle. It was, in terms of the 3, in terms of length, it's the one that comes in the middle at 100,000 words. So you just kind of write your story and see where you go. Now, if you know you're writing a short story, then your structure is different, and your process is going to be different. I don't know if that's a completely satisfactory answer. It's the best one I got. Yes, sir?
What's a good way to, end the climax? After the big thing in the end happens, how do you go down after that? How do you...
Yeah, so so there's a lot more to story structure and story beats. And after the climax, right, the big finish at the end, you have something that's called the denouement. Denouement. French word, I'm probably not saying it right. But it's the quiet stuff after the big finish that just kind of ends the story, right? So you might blow up the Death Star, but then you're going to have the award ceremony where everybody's smiling. So there's just something, after all this, that's got to bring you back down and put a nice ending on it. So that's the denouement. You've got to, here's what I use mine for. You kind of put a period on the end of all your messages, like what were you doing with each